So, hi, Ben. I have in my hands a very dangerous document, indeed, which is your personality assessment.
I have to admit, I've never been as frightened of a conversation as the one that we're about to have. Alrighty, folks. So, my friend Jordan Peterson, he apparently has a personality test, a personality assessment. I'm going to be going through all of that today. So let's jump right in. Okay, the following pages contain a series of items describing characteristics that may or may not apply to you. For each item, please use the scale to indicate the extent to which you feel the item describes you. I'm not interested in other people's problems. Strongly agree. I mean, honestly, probably 4. Respect authority. I mean, it's very difficult, which authority? My parents, 5. The government, 1.
Plus, shut the hell up and don't bother me again.
Respect authority, I'll say overall, societally, maybe a 4. Maybe. Believe that I am better than others, as a human being or at things. Those are not the same thing. So neither agree nor disagree, probably.
Okay, so what does that mean exactly?
Seldom notice the emotional aspects of paintings and pictures. Yeah, probably. I mean, it's a painting. Whatever, man.
This is a thing to say.
Okay, let's see the report.
Oh, for God's sake. Again we go.
We'll get to more on this in a moment. First, using the internet without ExpressVPN is like not paying attention to the safety demonstration on a flight. Virtually all of the time, it's fine. But then one day, the yellow mask drops down and you have no idea what to do. It's better to be safe than sorry. That's why we always use ExpressVPN. Every time you connect to an unencrypted network in cafes, hotels, or airports, any hacker on the same network can access your personal data, like your passwords and financial details. It doesn't take a lot of technical knowledge to hack somebody. These hackers can make up to $1,000 per person selling personal information on the dark web. ExpressVPN creates a secure encrypted tunnel between your device and the internet, so hackers can't steal your sensitive data. ExpressVPN is easy to use. Just fire up the app, click one button, get protected. Plus, it works on all devices, including phones, laptops, tablets, and more, so you can stay secure on the go. Secure your online data today by visiting expressvpn.com/BenYT. expressvpn.com/BenYT. You can get an extra 3 months for free. That's expressvpn.com/BenYT. expressvpn.com/BenYT. Go check them out today. Well, folks, I took the test, but I need somebody to, really dig into it. So we got Jordan Peterson to dig into my bizarre brain.
So, hi, Ben. I have in my hands a very dangerous document, indeed, which is your personality assessment with my Big 5 aspect test, the one I developed with a couple of co-authors, Colin DeYoung and some other people, Daniel Higgins. You took the test at understandmyself.com, and I've got your report. So do you want to know what sort of reprehensible character you are?
I have to admit, I've never been as frightened of a conversation as the one that we're about to have right now. I've never been analyzed in this way. So, I suppose I've steeled myself for this. So go for it. Have at it.
All right. Well, let's start with the issue of fear. You said you've never been as afraid as you are of this particular conversation, but I would like to point out that your neuroticism score is 3rd percentile. So you think you're afraid, but compared to people who are actually afraid, you're not afraid at all. Yeah, and so that was quite interesting. It makes sense to me that that's the case because you keep a cool head pretty much regardless of circumstance. And so neuroticism is the dimension that indexes negative emotion. And men are generally lower in negative emotion than women. That's cross-culturally true, probably because women are sensitive to infant distress and they're more sexually vulnerable. They're also less likely to prevail in physical combat, let's say, and so it makes sense that they're more attuned to threat. One of the most masculine aspects of your personality, which is your personality is quite masculine overall, is
That's good to know.
Low neuroticism. It is just so your detractors know that.
Yeah,
man.
Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah. And neuroticism breaks down into 2 aspects, hence the Big 5 aspect scale. It breaks down into withdrawal and volatility. People who withdraw, they're more likely to see the future as an impediment rather than a series of opportunities. And so you're very low in withdrawal, and so unlikely to back down, let's say, from a challenge. Your score puts you at the 3rd percentile. And so what that means for everybody listening is if there was 100 people in the room, you'd be less likely to withdraw than 97 of them. So, right. So, and then with regards to volatility. Volatile people are more, they sort of have an impulsive element to their negative emotion. So volatile people are easily provoked, and they're often provocative in response, but that's not because they're mean precisely. It's because it's a form of defensive aggression. And so you're low in anxiety, you're low in pain, because depression, for example, is a pain phenomena. You're low in defensive aggression as well. And I think that's part of what makes you a formidable debater, because you can keep your head and you're unlikely to be thrown by, anything that might emotionally annoy a more neurotic person. And so I would also say, if you had to choose a personality trait to have, just for your own well-being, low neuroticism is a good choice because you suffer less fundamentally.
Yeah, no, I think that my wife would agree with this. I'm pretty even keel. And that's definitely helped me both career-wise and certainly it's helped me family-wise, because kids can certainly make you neurotic. So
right. Well, in career-wise, there's 3 universal predictors of career success. So intelligence, that's just raw IQ. Conscientiousness, high, you want high conscientiousness. That's the second best predictor. It's about a quarter as good a predictor as IQ. And then neuroticism. I suspect that the highly neurotic people, when they're stressed, they fail, right? If they exceed a certain threshold for stress, they fail. Now, because of your neuroticism is so low, the probability is quite high that you would keep your head in any sort of crisis. And that would also enable you to take on more risks and be able to tolerate that physically without wearing yourself out. People who are high in neuroticism, they burn up a lot of energy per unit of threat, right? Because they're sort of hyper prepared. And so that can be very physiologically expensive. Okay, so let's turn from that to openness. Openness is the creativity dimension, essentially. That's a good way of thinking about it as a shorthand. This is one of the things that makes you an odd conservative, because generally speaking, conservatives are lower in openness than liberals. High openness makes you entrepreneurial, it makes you interested in ideas, and it indexes that. It also indexes interest in aesthetics, poetry and art, and that sort of thing. And so it breaks down into 2 aspects. One is basically interest in aesthetics. That would be more like standard creativity. People who are very high in the aesthetic aspect, let's say, they're likely to feel sensations of awe or tingling, for example, physiological tingling when they listen to music or when they're in a great cathedral, something like that. They've got a physiological sensitivity to beauty. And then the other aspect is intellect. And people who are high in intellect, which is also associated with IQ, tend to be very interested in ideas. The people high in intellect also are more likely to prefer nonfiction, right? And so you are at the 96th percentile for intellect. Intellect is also the aspect of personality that we refer to casually when we describe someone as smart, right? So you could think about that as the personality reflection of IQ. The fact that you have more of a political bent, say, than a literary bent, is not that you don't have a literary bent, but it's lesser. Your score for the aesthetics aspect is 51st. So that actually puts you at kind of the average for aesthetic sensitivity. And that was a bit of a surprise to me. I thought you might be higher than that, especially with your interest in music. But you are a fairly cut and dried guy, and most of your academic interest does seem to center around, the domain of nonfiction and that and the political.
Yeah, I wonder, for me when it comes to that, a lot of the questions I noticed were oriented towards sort of the meaning of beauty as opposed to appreciation of the beauty itself. So, for example, I appreciate listening to Brahms, I appreciate listening to Beethoven or reading a great work of art, but I don't find the extensive meaning in those things as opposed to just sort of enjoyment and pleasure. Is that something that breaks out, or is that sort of encapsulated there?
That's a good question. I don't think we know how that maps onto those aspects specifically. I mean, the aesthetic sensitivity would be more associated with that direct experience of meaning, right? And you're, like I said, you're more in the average range in relationship to that. But it also, we don't know how that might differentiate. Like, are you more interested in poetry or art or music, would you say?
Music, by far.
Yeah. Okay. So that's a more focal interest. And so we don't know enough about creativity to differentiate subcategories of aesthetic experience, right? We do know, though, this is another place, by the way, where your temperament is more typically masculine, because women and men are about the same with regards to openness overall, but women tend to be higher in aesthetics compared to men, and men higher in intellect compared to women. And that's reflected in the male preference for nonfiction and the female preference for fiction. And so that's another element of your character that tilts more in the masculine direction. So then we can move from that to conscientiousness. Now, conservatives tend to be more conscientious than liberals, although it's not as powerful an effect as it is for openness. And you're very conscientious, 96th percentile. Conscientiousness breaks down into industriousness and orderliness. And the conservative types tend to be particularly orderly. You are particularly industrious rather than orderly. 98th percentile for industriousness. Okay, so if we were going to account for your success, we could look at that in four ways, right? You're low in neuroticism, so that makes you very stress tolerant. You're very open, and so that gives you an edge on the entrepreneurial side. You're extremely industrious, and so what that essentially means subjectively, let's say, is that if you set your mind on a task, you'll pursue that task to completion to some degree independently of whether you're even interested in it. Right? So, yeah. So, I mean, you are driven by openness. And so there's going to be some compulsion of calling, let's say. But conscientious person is dutiful. And I would say, if you want to think about it theologically, maybe, a conscientious person is, they attend to their conscience, right? And so they're more likely to walk the straight and narrow path. And that's partly why they also do better economically.
One of the things I noticed in the questions there that was really interesting is and in the descriptions, this is the first time I'd seen anybody describe the aspect of personality where you feel antsy if you're not producing, which is certainly something that I have. If I sit for a long period of time, and it's not like I'm doing anything wrong, but if I'm like sitting and doing nothing, or even just, watching TV for too long, I start to feel guilty and upset with myself. And this is the first time I'd ever seen that sort of, to me, like, it happens to me a lot. And so this is the first time I'd ever seen that accounted for.
Yeah, well, I think that, so if you think about it biologically, a conscientious person is like a sled dog in a trace. It's like you have a job to do. And if you don't do it, then there's going to be, let's call it a pang of conscience. It's something like negative emotion. It's like the voice of negative emotion. That's a reasonable way of doing it. But you're not doing your duty. You're not serving your community. You're not serving the future. Like, conscientiousness is a cold virtue, and it's very future oriented. I kind of think about it as the abstract equivalent of agreeableness, right? Agreeable people are compassionate and warm, and that's kind of instinctual. It's a sort of in the moment thing. A conscientious person will hurt someone's feelings to secure their future, right? So there's a sacrificial element to conscientiousness too. So, because a conscientious person will sacrifice the present to the future and someone's feelings to their long-term well-being, right? So there's a coldness to it, but it's a coldness in the service of something that's virtuous, right? If you want to hire someone, you want someone who's intelligent, especially if the job is complex and requires continual learning. But you also generally want people who are conscientious, especially for managerial and administrative positions, because conscientious people also tend to be detail-oriented, and they're very reliable, which, that's kind of helpful if you actually want someone to do the work. And then they have that additional trait which you described, which is that proclivity to feel guilty if they're not constantly working, and one of the things that's interesting, I think, is that So the liberal types, especially the real more radical progressives, they tend to be high in openness but low in conscientiousness. And that means they don't have that guilt associated with, let's say, inactivity or lack of productivity. But they're very good at eliciting that guilt in conservatives, right? Yeah, and so liberals can call out conservatives for their failure to do their duty, and conservatives just like, they're instantly guilty about it, especially, yeah, exactly. So it's a point where the psychopathic can exploit the productive, because they can leverage guilt, and the psychopaths in particular are very good at that, because they put themselves forward as victims, and then they accuse the conscientious types that they want to sponge off of not doing their duty by them.
This is fascinating. At some point, I need you to do a breakdown, really, of historical personalities in terms of how you would analyze them, because I think it would be a fascinating exercise.
Yeah. Well, I have a colleague, he used to be a student of mine, Victor Swift, who's done textual analysis to extract out Big Five representations. And so that's becoming increasingly possible. So you can do an accurate analysis of a historical person's personality. Yeah, we should do it on Karl Marx.
Yeah, exactly.
Find out right. Yeah, no kidding. All right, so you're very industrious. In terms of orderliness, moderately high, 76th percentile. So you're not going to, orderliness can be, what would you say, at the extreme fringes could become something like obsessiveness. That industriousness can become a kind of driven compulsion. Like all of these traits can turn into something pathological, right? Every advantage comes with a corresponding disadvantage or temptation. Right. And that's a good thing for everyone to know, too. If you have a gift, you're going to have a set of temptations that go along with it. And conscientious people can be, especially if they're disagreeable, they can tilt a little bit in the tyrannical direction because they're orderly and they always want things done. And so that brings us to the discussion of agreeableness. So you are 50th percentile for agreeableness, so right in the middle. It's probably a little higher than average for a man, not a lot. I mean, well within the normative range. But women are more agreeable than men. And agreeableness breaks down, and your breakdown in agreeableness is very interesting. This is a good indication of how the aspect level analysis adds something to the more canonical Big Five traits. So agreeableness breaks down into compassion and politeness. And so you are low in compassion, 16th percentile.
Shocker.
Okay, so it's not absurdly low, right? I mean, if there were 6 people in a room, you'd be the lowest in compassion, but that's not first percentile or anything like that. You're still essentially right on the edge of within one standard deviation of the mean. But there's some things we know about people who are lower in compassion. So, for example, people who are high in compassion, if they see someone in pain or in emotional distress, the same circuits tend to be activated within them, right? Because you can imagine women are specialized for that instinctual compassion that's very useful for infants. But, toddlers aren't infants and neither are adult men. And so a little compassion goes a long ways when you're trying to encourage rather than to shelter. So, all right, so relatively low in compassion. So that's one of the things that also makes you resistant to the blandishments of the progressive mob. Politeness, by contrast, very high, 85th percentile. And that's interesting too. Some of the research I did with Jacob Hirsch indicated that conservatives were more polite than liberals. And so as a conservative, you have conservative elements, so that would be high conscientiousness, especially industriousness. This high politeness, that's another marker for conservative temperament. The openness, that's a, what would you say? That's a twist. And this is something probably that characterizes most of the Daily Wire founders that makes them atypical conservatives. That's partly why your enterprise is also interested in entertainment and movies and so forth, because you're these weird characters who are creative conservatives, and that's not a common combination. You need to be high in openness and high in conscientiousness, right?
And also low in neuroticism because you're willing to take risk. So it's like willingness to take risk, willingness to work hard in order to take that risk, and willingness to fail.
Yeah. So, and then the last one here is extroversion. And so extroversion is the positive emotion dimension. And positive and negative emotions are separate systems. They inhibit each other, they regulate each other, but they're separate systems. You can be high in positive emotion and high in negative emotion, right? You're quite a trip if that's a more typical female combination. Not that all females are like that, because they're not, but most of the people who are like that are female. Extroverted people are enthusiastic, and so that's really the core of that, what the joyful element of positive emotion. And women are higher in enthusiasm than men. The other aspect of extroversion is assertiveness. And assertive people, and this is certainly something that's very characteristic of you, assertive people are likely to dominate a conversation, for example. They're likely to speak first in a room. They're likely to take control, especially of a conversation, because extroversion is also associated with verbal fluency, as is intelligence and openness. And like you're astoundingly verbally fluent. And you can see why. High IQ, high openness, high extroversion. Right, so that puts you off the charts in terms of verbal fluency. So that's basically, well, that's you in a nutshell, I suppose. And you can see to some degree how your political philosophy is grounded in your temperament, which is the case for, us all fundamentally.
Well, thanks for doing this. I really appreciate it. And I'm going to show this to my wife and see what she thinks.
Yeah, well, thanks, Ben. It was fun walking through it with you, and much appreciated. And really good to see you again, by the way.
You too.
Okay? All right, I'm out of here.